Britain told one wartime lie so well that people still repeat it to children. Eat your carrots. They'll help you see in the dark. But that was only the harmless version, because during the Second World War, Britain also sold a cleaner story about morale, panic and bombing. And when you line up the posters, the reports and the directives, the home front legend starts to look less like memory and more like a very polished cover story. Now let's be clear, this is not a story about Britain being the villain of the war. Nazi Germany was a genocidal regime, and Britain was fighting for survival. But survival has a way of making governments tidy up the truth. Not always by inventing fantasy from scratch, usually by taking something partly true, sanding off the rough edges, and handing the public a version that is simpler, cleaner, and far more useful. And in wartime Britain, that happened again and again. First lie was almost cheerful. Wartime posters from the Ministry of Food literally told people that carrots would help them see in the blackout. At the same time, the British government pushed the idea that RAF night fighter success, especially the success of John Cat's Eyes Cunningham, had something to do with carrot consumption. But the real advantage was radar. Cunningham became famous for night interceptions because the RAF had aircraft interception radar, not because he was chomping through root vegetables like some orange-fueled superhero. That is what makes this one so revealing. It was useful in two directions at once. It helped explain away a secret technology, and it also helped the state on the home front by making rationing sound patriotic, practical, and even healthy. Eat what grows here. Trust what you're told. Don't stare too hard at the machinery behind the curtain. Even historians who disagree on whether the Germans were truly fooled agree on the important part. Britain was perfectly happy to let the public believe a myth because the myth did a job. The second lie was bigger and far more emotional. In Britain's favourite version of the war, the Blitz turned the country into one cheerful, united, stubborn mass of courage. Tea in the rubble, jokes in the shelters, no panic, no bitterness, no cracks. But the evidence collected around morale was much messier than that. Research using mass observation material notes that Churchill was not universally revered, that the idea of class unity has been heavily questioned, and that the image of morale presented by government and media helped create a myth later absorbed into popular culture. That does not mean courage was fake. It means courage existed alongside fear, resentment, fatigue, and confusion. Even the wartime discussion of morale was slippery. One mass observation definition warned that good morale requires a reasonable awareness of the true situation, and not confidence, not based on fact. That is the irony. The state needed morale, but morale built on selective truth is always unstable. It looks solid right up until something awful tears through it. And one of the clearest examples came in March 1943 at Bethnal Green. That night, 173 people died in a crush at the tube shelter, most of them women and children. Information about the tragedy was withheld at first. The inquiry was conducted in secret, and the findings were not fully published until the end of the war. The reason was plain enough: minimise public demoralisation and avoid handing the enemy a propaganda gift. In other words, when reality threatened the national myth, reality was the thing that got buried. The third lie is the darkest, because it sits inside how Britain remembers its own violence. Early in the war, Bomber Command was limited to strictly military targets. That was the formal line. But the policy changed. Official RAF museum material explains that area bombing meant bombing civilian built-up areas to destroy the homes of workers and crack morale. Another RAF historical source states that area bombardment had already been approved by the War Cabinet, and that the formal directive making German morale the primary target was issued on 14th of February 1942. That matters because the cleaner version most people absorb later is that Britain bombed military infrastructure and civilian deaths were a tragic side effect of imperfect accuracy. But the documents show something harsher. Morale was part of the target. Housing was part of the target. Civilian neighbourhoods were not just accidental scenery around the real objective, they were inside the logic of the campaign. That does not make Britain equivalent to Nazi Germany. It does make the tidy national memory impossible to defend without looking away from the paperwork. So what did Britain lie about during the Second World War? Not that the war had to be fought, not that Hitler had to be stopped. The lie was subtler than that, and in some ways more enduring. Britain lied about how clean survival looked. It hid technology behind nutrition, panic behind morale, and civilian targeting behind strategic language. None of those stories was completely invented. That is why they worked. They were half-truths, sharpened into tools. And that may be the real lesson in this case. Democracies do not stop using propaganda just because they are fighting dictatorships. Sometimes they just make it more believable, more respectable, more memorable. So memorable, in fact, that 80 years later, people still repeat the carrot myth with a smile, still talk about the Blitz as though it was emotionally seamless, and still prefer the story of clean bombing to the documented one. Britain won the war, but it also curated the memory of how it won. And once you notice that, the next question almost asks itself: which of today's wartime stories are being polished for us right now?